afternoon and welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. My name is LaCoria Meadows and I am a member of the CMC Board of Trustees. I also serve as the Director of OSU Extension here in Franklin County. It's such a pleasure to see everyone today. So let's move forward to today's forum. Today's forum, Redistricting Ohio, is sponsored by the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation and Hannah News Service. It is also presented in partnership with ACLU of Ohio and the League of Women Voters of Metropolitan Columbus. Each are represented here by many friends and associates, so please won't you help me to thank them for their sponsorship. Thank you. Thank you. On May 3rd, 2019, a three-judge panel from the United States District Court for the Southern District of Ohio declared that Ohio's 2012 district map is contrary to Article 1 of the United States Constitution. As, quote, an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, unquote, and ordered, quote, the enactment of a constitutionally viable replacement, unquote, prior to the 2020 presidential election. In simple terms, this is huge for our democracy, nationally, and also here in Ohio. So let's explore why. Let's turn to our experts. So please join me in welcoming Legal Director for the ACLU of Ohio, Freda Levenson. Associate Dean for Faculty and Ebersold Professor of Constitutional Law at The Ohio State University Moritz College of Law, Daniel Tokaji. Republican Strategist and Commentator Terry Casey. And our wonderful host, Chief Content Director, News and Public Affairs of WOSU Public Media, Mike Thompson. Mike, the podium is yours.
Great, thank you. How many are baseball fans here? How many baseball fans do we have? So even if you're not a baseball fan, you'll probably remember this situation. Look, remember back to the early 1990s, baseball players, Major League Baseball, were taking steroids. We all knew it. Nobody really cared. You do whatever, so they could hit the ball a little farther. But then it got a little crazy. Mark McGwire, Sammy Sosa, Barry Bonds, they started ballooning up like Popeye. They started obliterating home run records. They started to make the game look silly. One might say they were rigging the system. Well, then Major League Baseball at the time did not have any rules, so they changed the rules. So what does that have to do with gerrymandering? Look at redistricting. We have had gerrymandering for 2 centuries. It was called gerrymandering at the beginning after Governor Gerry from Massachusetts. And voters really didn't care. Lawmakers from states were drawing the districts to get rid of Congress people they didn't like, to tilt the maps in their favor. But it was happening year after year with mild opposition. But now, with software in this hyper-partisan, winner-take-all political culture we have right now, it's getting a little silly. Politicians are drawing maps that are even more creative, shifting the balance even more. So to date, the courts have stayed out of it. They haven't got involved with the rulemaking. But thanks to all of this, the courts may get involved. They are seeing how gerrymandering is crushing competition. It's making congressional maps in the political process look a little rigged. So it looks like the courts may step in to change the rules. We could get a ruling, likely we'll get a ruling tomorrow on 2 key gerrymandering cases, a bipartisan case, one for Democrats, one Republicans from Maryland and North Carolina. The Ohio case will hinge on that, and we could have some news tomorrow. We thought we might have it today, but we're going to have it tomorrow in all likelihood. So we'll look at how we got to this point, where we might go, and how the bottom line is, how does this affect the laws, the lawmaking process, for the laws that we all live under. So I'm going to start by going down the panel. I'll start on the far left, where he usually is, my left.
He is charged.
No, he's on your right, but he's on my far left. But I'm going to ask each panelist to briefly, I'm going to ask you to grade the current Ohio redistricting congressional map. I want you to give it a grade. 1 being very fair, 10 being extremely gerrymandered. And why you gave it that grade. Terry, we'll start with you. What grade would you give it, 1 to 10?
I'm not sure what 10 and 1 stand for, but basically I'm before the court pleading guilty and basically saying there is politics in politics. And actually, Mike mentioned way back, but actually I just completed a book on the 1800 election, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, involving people like Hamilton and other people, and it was nasty and dirty, and the rigging and things that went on in legislatures to figure out how the Electoral College vote would be counted. So this goes back to 1800, figuring out who was going to succeed, if Adams would get reelected or Jefferson would become president. But part of the question you're really asking, is Ohio guilty of extreme gerrymandering or mild gerrymandering? And
that's what I'm asking. 1 to 10, where is it?
I'll say about 5.72.
All right. Freda, what grade would you give it?
Okay, extreme, the very most extreme would be 10. I would definitely give it a 10. It's as gerrymandered as the map makers could possibly make it. That was their intention. They attempted to draw a map that was 13-3, 13 districts that would regularly produce Republican winners and 3 that would produce Democrats. We have documentary evidence that was their intention to try to do that. They determined that to do that would spread out Democrats too thinly. They would crack them too thinly and not leave a sufficient margin. So if there were some kind of blue wave or unusual election, they might risk one of the districts flipping over to being Democratic. So not being able to make that risk, they did the very best that they could do, which was 12-4. So it was the ultimate gerrymander that they were capable of. I might add that if the court doesn't step in and put a stop to gerrymandering, it will only be worse in this next decade, because due to the improvement of computer technology, due to improved richness of databases, the power to gerrymander, the ability to spread thinly can be done with much more confidence, and these 13-3 rather than 12-4 gerrymanders will be possible.
So Terry gives it, I'll round up. Terry gives it a 6. We have a 10 from Freda.
5.72.
I know, I round up.
Oh.
I'm in radio, I got to round up. And then, so 5.72, 10. Dan, what would you give it?
Well, so I'm a professor. We use letter grades, so I'm gonna just go with a straight F. Thanks. As Freda said, this is about as extreme a partisan gerrymander as you get, drawn to ensure that in a pretty purple state, 3/4 of the congressional districts, 12 of 16, would remain Republican throughout the decade, and that's exactly what happened. But I will say this, right? Even though the current plan gets an F, I'm going to give a B+ to both Republicans and Democrats in the state legislature for agreeing to redistricting reform for both state legislative districts and congressional districts next time around. These aren't perfect plans in my view. They're bipartisan rather than nonpartisan, but significantly better than the status quo, and not many states can claim that they've actually achieved a bipartisan agreement on redistricting reform as we have.
We'll get to the fix in a moment, but first, Dan, how did we get here? Yeah. I mean, every 2 years we get to pick politicians for Congress and for Senate, and some 6 years for Senate, 4 years for governor, but 2 years for Congress. Every 10 years, politicians pick their voters.
Yeah. So
how did this come about?
This has been going on for a long time, right? Gerrymandering, as was noted earlier, just about as old as the Republic itself. But it's not just your imagination. Both the severity of gerrymandering and the consequences of extreme partisan gerrymandering like we've seen in Ohio have gotten worse over the years, especially after the 2010 redistricting. So as a result of the one person, one vote rule, every 10 years, every state in the country has to redraw its district lines, both its state legislative districts and its congressional districts. Well, over the years, as we've become more partisan, and yeah, it's not just your imagination, partisan polarization really has gotten worse. And as technology has improved, the tools available at the mapmaker's disposal to maximize partisan advantage have increased. And so you see these extreme plans that are not only lopsided in terms of giving the majority party, whether it's Democrats or Republicans, a lasting majority that goes throughout the decade, but it's also sufficiently bulletproof. And what I mean by that is, to make another analogy, what you see smart gerrymanderers doing is creating a sort of flood wall, so that even in a really strong year for the other party, your party is guaranteed of having a supermajority of seats in either Congress or the state legislature. So to go back to the Ohio example, even though 2018 nationally was a darn good year for Democrats, well, Republicans were still able to capture, as they have since 2012, 12 of the 16 congressional seats that Ohio has.
Terry, what kind of software was John Adams using in the book you read there?
Well, they didn't have software then. More of the 1800 election was more about who would be governor and who would control the legislature in some states, but they were all looking at how it would affect the turnout of the presidency. So clearly it was vastly different then. Another problem back then, there was an argument, George Washington wanted each congressional district to only have 30,000 people. I think that initially it was around 38,000. Where now today, probably Ohio with 15 districts in 2022 will have about 773,000 people in each district, and that adds to the problem because, as one person told me yesterday, who's on the board of CMC, I won't reveal her name, well, I want my representative to represent my views. Well, the problem is one person can't make all 773,000 people happy because the districts have grown so big.
But Freda, the court's argument was that's not happening now because it's so unbalanced that people do not have a voice. And that is your argument before the courts, is why the system is broken here in Ohio.
Well, that's true. And I'd like to further address your question as how we got to this point in Ohio, because it's very interesting. The National Republican Project Red Map at the very beginning of the decade decided to invest in elections in certain states, states where the potential was possible to take control of certain state governments, control both houses of the legislature, control the governorship. So they invested heavily in those states to win them, knowing that they would have the power of the pen for the next decade. They would be able to write the maps when the next census came out, when the 2010 census figures came out, and new maps were written in 2011 and became the map in 2012. And they would draw maps, and they did, that would guarantee, absolutely guarantee these electoral results. They wouldn't have to invest then in costly elections across the decade. So they felt that it was a very good investment to invest millions of dollars, and they did invest millions in Ohio up front, and they got their money's worth. They did design this map that, as Dan pointed out, entrenched this solid and unassailable 12-4 Republican seat majority, even despite the blue wave in 2018.
Now, Dan, Republicans do not have a monopoly on this. Democrats have done this. I've seen it in places where I've lived. The Democrats have gerrymandered extremely creative districts.
And that's exactly right. And Maryland is an example of this. One of the cases that's before the Supreme Court right now and will be decided tomorrow, we expect, is the Maryland gerrymandering case, in which the Democrats held the pen. And in that case, they had 8 districts to draw. They gave 7 of those districts to Democrats and redrew one of them in a very bizarre fashion, which is why it's being challenged before the Supreme Court. So I think gerrymandering is a problem, and a serious problem for our democracy, whether Democrats are doing it or Republicans are doing it. It just so happens that you all will remember 2010 was a very good year for the Republican Party, so the Republican Party had the control over the redistricting process in more states than Democrats do. But of course, we don't know for sure what'll be the case in 2021 when districts are next redrawn. I think the Supreme Court should intervene so that both Republicans and Democrats are barred from extreme partisan gerrymandering.
How do you define extreme?
Yeah.
Fred, you said extreme. Where is the line? This is a political process. The Constitution says states and their lawmakers draw these lines. They're a political body, but where is the line between somewhat political and on steroids?
Well, the standards that the court in Ohio and in North Carolina and Maryland and Michigan and in Wisconsin, I might say there's a growing number of federal judges in states that have analyzed these cases, and the standards that they use and that the Supreme Court is being asked to agree with is that if you can demonstrate that there's an intention to gerrymander, by circumstantial or direct evidence, that there's a plan to gerrymander, to draw districts that are not responsive to voters, but instead lock in the will of the map drawers. So if there's that intent, if the map has that effect, if it can be demonstrated statistically, historically, whatever methodology you use, that the map actually is locking in results and violating the rules of the voters. And then if the map is entrenched, if it's sufficiently entrenched, if it's inviolable. And then last, if there's no justification for the map, because there could be a justification, there could be something that appears to be a gerrymander, but is actually compliance with the Voting Rights Act. There are certain situations that require some deviations from what just the other rules of map making would dictate.
So Terry, what should be the criteria? Is it geography, racial diversity, economic diversity, competitiveness, fairness? Where are the rules?
Well, that's the problem. There are no clear rules or priorities, because Dan and I debated up at the City Club in 2012 when there was a statewide issue on the ballot, which was defeated rather handily at that time. But the question is, everybody says, I want the districts to be fair. Then you say, what's your definition of fair? And some people say, I want compact, squarish looking districts. Some say, I want, example, the next congressional map will probably be 15 districts in Ohio. I want every district to be equal in their competitiveness, RD balance. That's not easy to figure out. And geographically, with Ohio's huge, diverse population and size, are you going to draw a district that goes from Holmes County, very Republican, that goes up and gets part of the inner city of Cleveland or Akron? I mean, to make 15 districts that are exactly equal in political competitiveness is literally mission impossible. And then people say, well, I want communities of interest held whole, but cities have shrunk. Like Cleveland's gone from 960,000 people down to 350,000. Columbus now, we can't put all of one congressional district in the city of Columbus because it'll be over 900,000 in population, and Columbus has got all these pockets that are part of Columbus but are not contiguous. You know, the geography is very difficult, but people cannot agree between compactness, competitiveness, or communities. What would be the criteria?
Is perfection the enemy of good, Dan?
Well, I was going to say exactly that. Not only should we not allow perfection to be the enemy of the good, but we shouldn't allow our disagreements over what is perfect to distract us from seeing what is truly awful, right? And so... So look, there are reasonable disagreements that Terry and I have had in the past over what's the best way of drawing districts, right? I tend to prioritize representational fairness, so rough proportionality between how many votes you get and how many seats you get, duh. And I think some competitive districts are a good thing. I don't think every district has to be competitive. Other people may value compactness more or keeping communities together, and we can have reasonable disagreements. And in fact, that's exactly what happened in the Ohio legislature, and miraculously, Republicans and Democrats managed to come up with a plan and a way of drawing districts that's fairer than what we've had. It's a different question, to my mind, when courts should intervene, right? And I think courts should only intervene in the most extreme cases, like the cases out of North Carolina, Maryland, which I just mentioned, Ohio, Michigan, where we see these egregiously imbalanced plans that just can't be defended with a straight face. I mean, even, you know, Terry and other Republican strategists, they don't really try to defend these extreme gerrymanders on the merits because they can't. And it's those cases, and only those cases, that I think courts should intervene in.
So Ohioans are roughly divided between Republicans and Democrats. There's a slight Republican majority, but they're not evenly distributed. Ohioans don't live in such a fashion that you could draw a map where every single election would be competitive, unless you draw a very bizarre-looking map that wouldn't be at all compact. There is some what you call natural gerrymandering. It's a fact that Democrats tend to live in more urban areas and Republicans tend to live in more suburban areas. So you can't have every election competitive. What's important is to have districts be responsive. That's probably a better word, where the voters vote, and the result of the election is a function of the turnout and the voters' preferences, rather than the result of the way the map is drawn. So the map has to be drawn in a fair and neutral way, without an intention to engineer results, but instead by following the neutral principles of map drawing, which are compactness. Compact districts are good, because that means they're clean and voters know where they live. Confusion has been a really big problem in some of these really messy, highly irregular, ugly districts where voters don't know where they live, they don't know who their representatives are. Well, they know where they live, but they don't know what district they're in. So compactness is an important criteria. Contiguity is also respected as a neutral principle that's necessary. And respect for political boundaries, because that also helps with observing communities of interest, keeping them together. So
you mean county lines and city lines?
County lines, and it helps people know where they're voting as well.
I just wanted, Dan mentioned about the 2010 election. Here's an interesting little factoid until preparing for today. I didn't realize the 2010 election, going into that election not too far back, Ohio had 10 Democrats and 8 Republicans. And I'm sure people on this side would say, well, that sounds good. Well, the voters in that election defeated 5 different incumbent Democrat members of Congress, some of them like Mary Jo Kilroy, Zach Space, by big margins, about 15%. So the Ohio delegation resulted after that 2010 election in being 5 Democrats and 13 Republicans. And then what the legislature did, Ohio shrunk, lost 2 seats. They basically knocked out 1 Democrat seat, knocked out 1 Republican seat. Then you had the election, and that's kind of how we got where we're at. And in fact, the plan that now exists in Ohio for the congressional district was adopted in the legislature bipartisanly by a very large margin, and it also benefited in Ohio going from 1 African-American member of Congress to 2, which is the 2 out of 16 is very representative of Ohio's population. So what happened in the current map is not necessarily all bad, but part of it is what the voters did in 2010. And to be honest, members of Congress tend to want to keep their district, and they tend to lobby members of the legislature. So there's a question of how much is incumbent protection or incumbent redistricting, how much of a factor should or should that not be?
The short version of the story is that Republicans drew a pretty good gerrymander in 2001. It got a little unstable towards the end of the last decade. They drew a brilliant gerrymander in 2011 that has remained absolutely stable and impregnable throughout this decade. And you're winning 1 election, in 2010 in this case, shouldn't allow you to keep a hold of your entire 3/4 of your congressional seats in your entire state legislature for the rest of the decade. That's just not fair.
Let's get. I want to get to the. Let's get to the fix that Dan mentioned earlier that voters approved in 2018 by an overwhelming margin. I'll run it down to try to keep it brief. It has incentives for Republicans and Democrats to draw a bipartisan map. To pass a map, lawmakers would need a 3/5 majority and support of at least half of the members of both parties. So you need not a supermajority, but a good majority in the legislature and lawmakers from both sides to agree to the map. If that doesn't work, it goes to a commission of 7 members. At least 2 minority party members would have to agree to that map. If that doesn't work, it goes back to the legislature, and at least 1/3 of each party's members would have to vote for it. So again, a slightly less incentive. If that doesn't work, it goes back to the legislature, and this is where it gets possibly ugly. A simple majority of the legislature can approve whatever map they want. But instead of lasting for 10 years, it lasts for 4. And the other fixes are it restricts how counties and local governments can be split, and it says any plan must not unduly favor a party or incumbent. So Dan, this is incentives. Is this going to fix our problem if the courts do not get involved?
I think it'll make it better in Ohio for the next cycle. The question is how much better. I have to give a hat tip to my colleague at Ohio State, Dick Gunther, who is in the audience and was one of the people responsible, along with many others, and some of whom are in this room, for helping put together this plan. Look, it's a compromise. Then that's partly why it's complicated, right? Republicans, Democrats, and outside groups like the League of Women Voters, Common Cause, sat down for weeks and months and negotiated this stuff and came up with a plan that is not perfect, but it's pretty good, and I think is likely to lead to fairer districts and at least some greater competition than what we've had now. And at the end of the day, that's the bottom line: fairer and more competition.
Freda, quickly, then Terry.
And interesting. Okay.
Okay, thank you. Well, I agree that it is some improvement, definitely, but we cannot forget that this was a compromise. As Mike mentioned, it devolves into this fourth step allows a single party by simple majority to dictate the map. And the standards, because they were compromised of necessity in this ballot issue, aren't as strong as they should be. The current map has 32 split counties. The issue 1 would permit, the ballot issue 1 that passed, the fix, would allow 23 split counties, so that's an improvement. Our remedial map that we offered to the court as a demonstration map in the gerrymander case in Ohio that we just won only splits 14 counties. So better maps can be drawn and should be demanded. It's an inhibition against gerrymandering. It restrains gerrymanderers from being able to do their thing. In addition, with regard to city splits, the current map divides 73 Ohio cities. Issue 1 does not limit the number of cities that can be divided at all. It simply says that 2 cities, Cleveland and Cincinnati, can't be split. The remedial map, again, that we offered in our gerrymander case divides only 27 cities. So again, we can have much higher standards than ballot issue 1 offers. It's a big improvement, though, in terms of the public oversight that it offers. People can't retreat into a bunker, as they did. The map drawers retreated into what they themselves called a bunker to draw our current map. There will be no more bunkers.
Terry, Republicans negotiated because they feared another ballot issue would go farther. So that's why that was their incentive to negotiate with Democrats to come up with this plan. In the current makeup of the legislature, still dominated by Republicans, can you see them saying, you know what, we like the maps the way they are, we're going to live with this for 4 years and try again?
Well, interestingly, in 2009, John Husted, when he was in the legislature, offered a similar plan to what evolved out this time. Chris Redfern, as the Democrat chairman, former legislator, said, nah, we don't want to compromise and do anything fair, because he thought Ted Strickland would be reelected and they'd control the process. Obviously, that gamble didn't pay off, and they lost big in 2010. So this is definitely a compromise, but it's never going to be perfection. And the people, unless you've been in the room, I wasn't involved in these current districts, but I'm involved in the past. The difficulty is when you draw the first 2 or 3 districts, it's easy to have them look good and meet some criteria you might have, but then you have all these bits and parts. And I remember in 1981 when Jim Tilling was doing the legislative map, we had Franklin County nicely worked out into 8 districts, et cetera. Then he had half of Pickaway County left over with nowhere to go. So he said, well, I'm going to put it on to Franklin County, and then you can tie it in that way. And it worked out, but the state rep that had that area didn't like it. But the problem is you've got these bits and pieces, and in some cases, there's been some exceptions by the courts. In congressional districts, you got to have them exactly equal in population, which makes it even more difficult to get it to all balance out. Now, in state legislative, In the Constitution, they give a plus or minus either 5 or 10%, so you got a little more flexibility. It doesn't have to be exactly equal down to the person of each district.
What about commissions? Some states use independent commissions. Freda, do you think that's a good idea?
Yes, they've, in practice, proven to do well in some states. Obviously, the quality depends on the qualifications of the commissioners, the selection process, the standards and criteria that they used, and the oversight that's available. So it's not just necessarily commission or non-commission that would be the litmus test of whether it's good or bad, but there can be very, very well high-performing commissions.
Yeah. And California is one that's got a commission, but the commissions, one side or the other side, depending upon how you write it, can grab and rig who sets on that. An example in California, to talk about fairness, 86.8% of the seats are now held by Democrats in a county that is more, or state that's more Democratic, but it's hardly representative. And if you looked at the California map, you'd see things that make the snake on the lake in Ohio look kind of modest. I mean, they got one district that runs all the way from San Francisco to the Oregon border. They got another one that runs over 300 miles along Nevada and Arizona. I mean, some of the districts out there are pretty bad, but there was a commission, and on paper it seems like it's bipartisan or nonpartisan, but the reality is it's rigged for one side.
Sounds like we should have an ugly district competition with California.
I think Ohio would win. Are really bad.
So I'm actually from California originally, and I'll disclose, know some of the people who worked on the California districting plan. It's a whole lot better than what we've had in Ohio. And it's important to distinguish nonpartisan redistricting, which is what California has, Arizona as well, from the bipartisan system that we'll have here. Personally, I prefer nonpartisan, but bipartisan is certainly better than what we've had in Ohio. And independent analyses of California actually show that it's a pretty fair plan, a lot fairer than what you've generally gotten from partisan or even bipartisan bodies. No plan is perfect, but what California has done, as well as Arizona, they're pretty good.
We're going to get your audience questions in a moment, so if you'd like to start lining up behind the microphone there, we'll get to your questions in just a moment. If we could speculate a bit, we expect the court ruling to come down tomorrow, some kind of court ruling. We have no idea if they're just going to punt, if they're going to impose radical changes on the gerrymandering system. We'll start with the law professor. Dan, any predictions on what the court might do?
I've learned that I'm no Jimmy the Greek over the course of time. Those of you who are older in the room will remember.
He was a gambler on
Yeah, right. So I don't predict, but let me just sort of explain rather than predict. I think there are really three big issues in these cases. One of them, do the plaintiffs have standing? Are they people or entities that are entitled to sue? Secondly, is this a political question, which is not what it sounds like. Courts decide questions involving politics all the time. What that means is whether this is a question that is reserved for the political branches of government, whether it is one that can properly be decided by the court. And then thirdly, if they get past those first two hurdles, do the plans violate the Constitution? And the main claims are that it violates either the Equal Protection Clause or the First Amendment right of association. Boy, there are any number of ways that these could come down, but I think the two justices to watch on the court, this I'm more confident of, are Chief Justice Roberts, who is likely going to be the author of the opinion, it seems, from those that have been handed down so far in other cases. We can ascertain that. And the newest member of the court, Justice Kavanaugh, who really has no track record on this kind of issue, having been a judge on the D.C. Circuit before. So I think we really don't know, and anybody who's prognosticating is really just giving an educated guess, which I'm going to avoid doing here.
Freda, your Ohio case depends on this one. We suspect,
It could rise or fall with this case. Obviously, if this case says that gerrymandering is non-justiciable, if, as Dan explained, it's a political question that courts can't enter into, that would pretty much be a death knell for our case. But if any narrower ruling, or if an affirmation of the cases below occurs, that would be very encouraging for our case. And I think we don't know what's going to happen, obviously. There's a little bit of hope to be taken from, sometimes you read the tea leaves, when you look at the justices' questions in the oral arguments, reading the transcript and listening to the oral argument of the two pending gerrymandering cases, North Carolina and Maryland, Justice Kavanaugh, who's going to be pivotal here, as Dan said, asked questions that suggested strongly that he was very deeply concerned that there's no way that voters can vote their way out of this situation. And if there's going to be a fix, it's going to have to come from the courts. And for him to be disturbed by that and provoked by that bodes well, particularly if the citizenship question goes the other way, because that citizenship question, if that's permitted to be asked, that's going to put gerrymandering on steroids.
That's the citizenship question.
I'll agree with what's just said. The Supreme Court members are troubled by this whole mess, and that's why they've avoided it. And I'll remind you, the U.S. Constitution, it's only Article 1, Section 4 is very clear that state legislatures shall set the places and manners of holding elections, but they do in the Constitution say Congress can, you might add should, get in and set rules. The question is, and I'm going to quote former Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, who was one of the founders of the ACLU, in a 1946 decision, he warned the judiciary, quote, not to enter this political thicket, because he recognized this is politics at the ultimate degree, and if the courts can be troubled and not like something, but if you've got to come up with a solution and guidance to different district courts and courts of appeals in the whole country of where the difference is between what's wrong gerrymandering versus what's okay, that's a tough kind of thing. So don't be surprised if they duck, bob, and weave, because it is a complicated political issue where the Constitution did speak to it pretty loudly.
But what software was he using?
Yeah.
Pardon?
What software was that guy using to draw his districts?
Really briefly, that case was decided in 1946, the Colgrove versus Green. That's been overruled by the Supreme Court. It was overruled in 62 by Baker versus Carr, which came to the opposite conclusion. It said that redistricting is
the Tennessee
justiciable.
case.
Well,
yes, correct.
To put this in historical context, we should remember that Justice Frankfurter was arguing in opposition to the principle that became known as one person, one vote. Thank God he lost that argument ultimately, and let's hope he loses the next one too.
All right.
I apologize for quoting an ACLU. He was more making the point about it's a thicket, and how do you get into the thicket and how do you get out of it? And again, my opinion, I think Congress ought to speak to and better define some of these rules and differences.
Well, Congress tried to with H.R. 1, as you know, Terry, but somehow there doesn't seem to be any Republican support for that bill, strangely enough.
For us non-legal scholars, H.R. 1 is what? Dan, what's H.R. 1?
Oh, that's an omnibus reform bill, which the Democratic-controlled House made its first legislative priority, enacted it several months ago. And by the way, I actually agree with Terry. I would love to see some bipartisan compromise in Congress on not only redistricting, but lots of issues of election reform. But as I think we all know, Congress is a dysfunctional mess right now, and there's virtually no likelihood of that happening.
One of the reasons for that is gerrymandering. Let's go to audience questions. It is our tradition here at the Columbus Metropolitan Club to take questions from the audience. We ask you to keep your comments brief and to put a question mark at the end of your question. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mike. I'm Kathy Fox. In listening to all of this, my sense is that Terry is very much a pessimist because he's found an anecdote for every solution that's been offered today. And my question is there a change that Terry would support and find optimistic that is better than the map drawing process that has been elaborately explained? Because we've been told it's better than what we have, but what we have is an F.
If I hear your question right, you want me to push my optimism button. And part of the optimism, I think we ought to give Ohio some credit for what they did in both state legislative and congressional. It's not going to be perfect, not going to make everybody happy. And maybe out of this Supreme Court decision that maybe comes out tomorrow, maybe the court will delineate some things of what's on the don't do list, and here's what you can do. But it's just complicated because we live in an era right now where people are so competitive and so battling about the positions and who controls the power in government that it's a winner-take-all mentality on both sides, fed by cable TV. But there is some things that Ohio's done that might make it better. But again, it's not going to make it perfect. Anybody that sits there hoping that I'm only going to have the vote on my representative who only votes and reflects my views, that's not going to happen when you got a congressional district of 773,000 people for the next 10 years.
Okay, and I will just say, you didn't answer my question, and I would like to be able to select my representatives rather than having them select me. Thank you.
Hi there, Jen Miller, Director of the League of Women Voters of Ohio. We are proud of our victories in 2015 and 2018 at the ballot box. We do think it'll be better systems, but we are also really proud and honored to have joined the ACLU of Ohio and A. Philip Randolph Institute and many others in this case. And so I have two questions. The first would be for Dan. Can you explain how a victory at the court and issue 1 could work together to make better map making for the future? And also maybe Freda or someone would like to talk about how gerrymandering actually is feeding our partisan politics today.
Great question. So how can a victory in the Supreme Court and what we've done here in Ohio quite remarkably work together? I don't want to say that Ohio's problems are completely solved, even though I anticipate things are going to be better in the next decade. And if the court does intervene in the North Carolina or Maryland cases that are currently before it, or the Michigan and Ohio cases that could be coming up before it next term, I think that will put legislators and other line drawers on notice and make them much more careful, much more reluctant to manipulate the lines, because nobody wants to draw districts only to have them thrown out by a court a few years later. So I think the Supreme Court's decision, if they do strike down one of the extreme partisan gerrymanders before it or likely to be before it, will have its most important implications in states where there's really no bipartisanship, where one party controls, but can also have a positive impact here in Ohio.
To build on that, one of the big tools that we had in bringing the gerrymandering case in Ohio was a treasure trove of documents that the League of Women Voters had obtained following the redistricting, in which it was very clear that the gerrymanderers were very open about the fact that they had gerrymandered because it was lawful. It had never been strucken down, although it had been repeatedly tested at that point in the Supreme Court and in other courts. So even though the map was drawn in secret, the fact that they were gerrymandering was open and notorious. They crowed about it. This Project Red map that I referred to later was open. Everyone knew that this investment had been made and that this was trying to be done. If we should lose this case in the Supreme Court, the map makers will never be so open again. They were outed this time. Everyone knows what they did. It will be driven underground. We won't have this treasure trove of evidence to show intent if we're ever going to try to resurrect gerrymandering as a cause of action in the future. So it means that issue 1 is critically important, especially in the event of a loss, because it sheds a light on it for the public. The process can't be secret anymore. And we'll still have the protections, even though it's not perfect and gerrymandering is still possible under ballot issue 1, it still will go a long way towards at least letting citizens know what's happening. So critically important. And they will work together beautifully, of course, if there is a victory.
We'll get Terry and we'll get one more. Quickly,
One little quick thing. If you think these map makers are always geniuses and always get what they've done, little history lesson in Ohio. 1991, I wasn't involved. Republicans drew the state legislative maps, and they did such a good job. By 1998, they lost control of the Ohio House. Armin Budish became speaker. So just because people draw up maps and make assumptions doesn't mean it always, and this could work either way, it doesn't always mean that it works off and pays off in terms of future elections.
Yeah, but in the last 20 years, we've seen a sea change in technology, which has made it much easier to draw gerrymanders that are not only extremely lopsided, but durable and able to last throughout the decade.
Okay. Go ahead, please.
I'd like to address the comment about the Franklin County, Pickaway County redistricting. I live in Marble Cliff. I found out by working the polls that we vote Democratic. And frankly, for Marble Cliff and Grandview to go down into Pickaway County, is anybody surprised that I feel disenfranchised?
Good, Terry.
If you're unhappy, you should have seen the congressional map that we have right now today. I live in Clintonville, and that's where Mary Jo Kilroy, but they deliberately put Mary Jo Kilroy in the 12th district, hoping she wouldn't run in the new 3rd district, and then they drew a little finger across I-71 and the railroad tracks to reach where Dave Leland's house was, and so he would be in the 3rd district, and then for Ted Celeste, at the request of Democrats, they made sure he was in the 3rd. So unfortunately, there's a lot of things that happen on both sides that aren't pretty and you might not like, but these things happen.
But Marble Cliff and Grandview vote Democratic. We do. We elected Obama.
Let's get to, that raises a good question. You're not going to guarantee that your person is going to get elected to Congress. That's what, because if you live in a, let's just say far western Ohio, if you have a congressional district in Preble County, it's likely going to be represented by a Republican member of Congress. So if you're a Democrat in that county, you're out of luck, right? Even if it's the compact district that's you know, includes like interests and things like that. If you're a Democrat in far western Ohio in Preble County, you're likely not going to get your guy in office.
But that's not going to be as a result of diabolical map making. That's going to be as a result of the way people live.
And here's the thing.
Speaking of just really quickly, of the, you know, Franklin County Congressional District 3, that was actually the centerpiece of the map that we're living under right now. That was drawn, the map makers called it the Franklin County Sinkhole. Because that was a place to sink Democratic votes, and they drew it as a sinkhole, like a black hole for votes to disappear into. And they designed the rest of the map around it. There was no Congressional District 3 around Franklin County before then. And in fact, the charge of the map makers was to eliminate 2 districts because Ohio was losing 2 districts then, not adding. But they created a new one in order to render the adjacent districts strong Republican strongholds.
The objective was to create a potential of being a second minority district that we could have an African-American member of Congress, and people forget the history of the 60s and 70s up to the 80s when particularly Southern Democrats deliberately rigged districts and dispersed black votes so there couldn't be any black members of Congress.
Well, Dan, let Dan chime in and we'll get to a couple questions.
Look, elections have winners and losers, so there are always going to be some people that are unhappy. That's just reality. But here's the thing. Imagine that you woke up on election morning and went to vote, and you cast your ballot, and it was put in the box, or you clicked that machine, and you found out later that your vote didn't count because the result was preordained. Well, we actually don't have to imagine it because that's the situation for all of our congressional elections in Ohio. That's not right. We hope it'll be changing not only here but throughout the country if the Supreme Court does the right thing in the next decade.
All right, time for one, maybe 2 more questions. Sure. Go ahead, sir.
Freda alluded to my question a little bit. So we've talked about gerrymandering through map making. Can you talk about the other anticipated Supreme Court ruling on the citizenship question and speculate about that ruling, and also speculate about the impacts on representation through that.
Yeah, so the question before the Supreme Court in the census case, which I also have my eye out on and we'll be talking about on Friday in Washington, is whether the Trump administration, specifically the Department of Commerce, was justified in asking a question or adding to the census a question on citizenship. Are you a citizen with respect to everybody in the household? A question that has not been on the census in decades because it depressed turnout and has actually never been asked in the universal form that the Trump administration has proposed it. In recent weeks, as many of you have no doubt seen, we've gotten direct evidence about what the real reason for asking this question was, as documented in some of the email from the late Mr. Hoffeller, a Republican strategist who's been called the Michelangelo of gerrymandering. The reason was to advantage Republicans and non-Hispanic white. So there's a direct connection between the gerrymandering cases and the census case that's currently before the court. And if the Trump administration gets its way and this question is added, it will be gerrymandering on steroids, especially if the gerrymandering cases come out the wrong way.
I want to get Terry to respond quickly, then I'll get to one more question, then we got to go home. I
disagree. If Dan was aware, since 1820, every census, either on the long form or the short form, they've asked some kind of variation of either census, parents' national origin. So this is not new, this kind of question. Now, there's been differences whether it's on the long form or the short form, but since 1820, they've asked some sort of variation of that question.
Anecdote that this Tom Hoffeller, who was the mind behind the citizenship question, also designed the Ohio map. And we have, he passed away in 2017, but we had documents authored by him that we used in the gerrymandering trial. And among them was an email that he wrote talking about moving some dog meat voting territory into the Franklin County Sinkhole. That's how they regarded voters. That's how much they honored the will of the voters.
Okay, one more question, go ahead.
I know it's not a secret, the League of Women Voters is persistent. You guys forgot my second question, which is how gerrymandering breeds partisanship, and really then how partisanship breeds gerrymandering.
Can I answer that one? If you have a gerrymandered district, the only competition in the district is between members of the one party. If it's a heavily Republican district, the Democrat doesn't count. Or if it's a heavily Democratic district, the Republican doesn't count. So the competition is in the primary. How do you win a primary? You cater to the far extreme of your voters in that district. So what you end up doing is electing a far right or a far left members of Congress, less willing to compromise, and that really is the root of this problem. So with that, I want to thank you all. Good job. I remember doing talk shows on this issue 20 years ago, and I could not get a caller. The fact that there are more than 200 people here interested in this issue gives us hope that we can find a fix. So thank you all for coming.
What a vibrant discussion. Thank you all for being here. I hope that you found today's forum to be enjoyable. So before we leave, let's please thank our sponsors, the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation. Thank you so much. Thank you. Hannah News Service. Thank you. Thank you, Steve. As well as our partners, ACLU of Ohio and the League of Women Voters. Thank you so much. And last but certainly not least, let's thank our esteemed panel, Freda Levenson, I want to make sure I say that correctly, thank you, Daniel Tokaji, Terry Casey, and Mike Thompson. And also thanks to each of you for being here. Have a wonderful afternoon.